Hello, class. Today is our first lesson of the Reconstruction Amendments. Today we'll be talking about the 13th Amendment and comparing that to the Emancipation Proclamation. And I really like this song in the background and the video. Every time I would come home from a deployment and I'd be walking down the ramp into the airport, uh, looking for my family who had come to welcome me home, and that song was always in my mind. So that's kind of why I played it. So, like I said earlier, today this is the first lesson in our Reconstruction Amendments unit. The idea actually of this unit came from a student question last year who said, "Hey, Mr. V, why on earth would we need the 13th Amendment if the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed?" And so that's where the impetus or the beginning of this lesson came. And today, what we're going to discuss is, of course, the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation. Today's learning goals, what I'd like for you to be able to do is remember and recall key facts concerning the 13th Amendment. I'd like you to be able to analyze and distinguish the difference between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And then finally, at that higher level of learning, I'd like you to evaluate Lincoln's use of the Emancipation Proclamation and why the 13th Amendment was necessary after all. Here's the text of the 13th Amendment, and I'll go ahead and if you can read along with me, that would be great. The 13th Amendment. Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So, if we really look at it, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States and any territory where the United States had jurisdiction. And here's what I'd really like you to look at and focus in on Section 2. For the first time in our U.S. Constitution, the federal government was grabbing power for itself over the states. As we had discussed earlier in our Bill of Rights and our U.S. Constitution lessons, the U.S. Constitution and its amendments are the supreme law of the land. So this 13th Amendment abolishing slavery is now the supreme law of the land. Historian Eric Foner called the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, which we're going to talk about in this unit, as the second founding. Now, although his argument was very, very convincing in his book, I rather think about it, but you think about it how you would like, as it's the journey of our country living up to its ideals. If you remember in the preamble, the founders said that they can't create a perfect union, that this document would be a more perfect union. That means we would always look towards perfection, but we would never attain it. And that I would like to say that the Reconstruction Amendments helped us on that journey of meeting our founders' goals. But one can't help but look at the irony of it, or the contradiction that this seems to present in the philosophy of America up to this point. The founders feared an all-powerful government, and that's why they first did the Articles of Confederation. That's more of a history lesson. If you were in my history class, we cover this quite a bit. But it's the irony of it is that now the federal government is taking power from the states and giving oversight to it of the federal government. This is what they feared. Well, after 5 or 6, 7, 8 decades, or 4 score and 20 years ago, What we found out is that states' power needed check too. We have laws to check individual power, but the state's power had to be checked too. If a state was going to go against go against the federal government, then the federal government had to have a tool to use to check that power to keep the Union. The Civil War had answered the question of slavery. Now the Constitution would be the tool to enforce it. So, getting back to the student's question, why do we need a 13th Amendment if the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War? Well, let's look at exactly what the Emancipation Proclamation does, or what it did. There's a lot of misinformation, and it's well-intentioned about the Emancipation Proclamation. So hopefully this will clear it up. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Lincoln, freed only the slaves in the rebel states. And then it could only be enforced it could only be enforced in territory that was controlled by the Union Army. So it didn't free all the slaves. It didn't apply to the border states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, Delaware, and out west, Missouri. And the border states were states that held slaves but did not secede from the Union. So President Lincoln had to really walk a tightrope here to keep those states on his side to win the war. So the Emancipation Proclamation, although it's a great document, and President Lincoln, as you'll see later on in the presentation, thought that this is what he would be remembered for. This would be his legacy. It didn't do everything that we are told today that it did. Some things about the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln waited for a partial victory at Antietam to announce it, to show that his army was strong enough to enforce it. He was able to do the Emancipation Proclamation under a war power that he had as the commander-in-chief of the Union Army. He used it as kind of an addition by subtraction. And what do I mean by that? Is that Black Americans on both sides worked mainly worked in the rear, hospital guard, or hospital and hospital work, and cooking and logistics work and morgue duties. So the more Black Americans that he could take from the southern side to move those men to fight on the Union side, the more men that he could use in the front lines to fight the war. So as the South was getting weaker, the North was getting stronger. That's what I mean by addition by subtraction. And again, like I said earlier, he needed the border states to win the war, and that's why the Emancipation Proclamation, in my opinion, didn't count towards the border states. And then another fact that's often missed is that it kept England from entering the war, because England was thinking about entering the war, of course, on the southern side. But when Lincoln did this Emancipation Proclamation action, England had already ended slavery in its territories. They had stopped the slave trade earlier, in 1807, stopped the slave trade. In 1833, abolished slavery in its colonies. So it very well couldn't support the South and its pro-slavery stance. So the Emancipation Proclamation also kept England from entering the war. So as you can see, it's kind of an idealistic versus realism approach. The idealism of ending the horrible institution of slavery aligned with the realist goal of winning the war. Lincoln thought the Emancipation Proclamation would be his true legacy, so let's not get it twisted. He truly believed in ending the institution of slavery. But his main goal was winning the war. That was his true goal. And if you were in my history classes last year, when we studied the Civil War a little bit, I show a quote of Lincoln saying that if he could free all the slaves and win the war, he would. If he could free some of the slaves and win the war, he would. If he could free none of the slaves and win the war, he would. So President Lincoln was in a crisis. The country had split, and his main goal was winning the Civil War. However, his idealistic views of what America should be and is also align perfectly with winning the war, and he used both to his credit. So, in a quick review, the 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery throughout the United States. For the first time, the federal government took power from the states and put itself in a sovereign position over the states. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive war power decision with realist benefits and ideological purpose. And remember, it didn't affect the condition of the slaves in the border states. The materials available for you are on Canvas. I've attached a copy of the 13th Amendment, so please read that. I've also put the Emancipation Proclamation on Canvas. Please read that. It's not a huge undertaking. It shouldn't take you more than a half an hour to read both of them. I want you to review this presentation again and then watch this presentation again. And your assignment will be to write a 2-paragraph essay by choosing one of the following questions. Why was the 13th Amendment necessary if Lincoln had already issued the Emancipation Proclamation? What is the irony involved with the 13th Amendment? What were the benefits of the Emancipation Proclamation to the Civil War effort? And then, of course, my advocatus diaboli, or my devil's advocate, you get a chance, whoever it is this week gets a chance at 20 extra credit points for reviewing this presentation and fact-checking the presentation and presenting that or submitting that review on Canvas. Have a good day.